That email. Yeah, I got you. All right. Well, here we are, continuing our journey through David's life. We've done the mighty men. We've looked at his wives. Actually, yeah. Oh, yeah. We got one to finish. I thought, wait a second, I messed that up. No, I didn't mess it up. We got one little bit to finish from last week on the wives, and then we moved to David's children.
Right. Not all of David's children, because there are too many. We don't know a lot about some of them, but we do know a lot about three of them.
So, you ready? You want to off and go?
Go ahead.
Hit the ground running? All right, so a couple of these slides you saw last week, just to get us back in our mindset of what we were talking about. We'd worked up to Bathsheba. We talked about Bathsheba being David's final wife, because remember we counted through number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, and then final wife. And we had just gotten to the point where Nathan is coming in to talk to David, and we decided we probably should stop here because we wouldn't have time to do it justice. So David writes the letter that Uriah actually carries with him that tells the troops to retreat back and to leave him at the front. And then we saw this picture last week where the message comes back to King David saying, Uriah, your servant, the Hittite, is dead. And of course he knows that. It was his doing. And so when the time of mourning was over, David sent and brought Bathsheba, as the her here in this verse, to his house, and she became his wife, and then she bore him a son. But the thing that David had done was evil in the sight of the Lord. And that's where we got to last week. And we thought, Dr. Cloud and I thought, we need to unpack that a little bit. It was evil in the sight of the Lord, what he had done as far as committing adultery and murdering Bathsheba's husband. It's also more than just that sentence, because the first child that we'll talk about is actually never makes it because of these activities of David. So before that gets told to David, before he realizes that the child that Bathsheba is going to have will not live, Nathan, the prophet, comes to talk to David. You want to go through that, or do you want me to do it?
I'll talk about it a little bit.
All right.
For those of you who, with your children or grandchildren, watch VeggieTales, the VeggieTale parallel here is King George and the Rubber Ducky. And they clean the story up quite a bit. And so the principle is there, but it's really not very good. But they do a flannel board that is excellent, and that's the parable of Nathan. Nathan comes and tells a parable. There are not very many parables in the Old Testament, and some people don't call this a parable. I think it's an excellent example. But Nathan explains there, a rich man and a poor man, and when they're doing the VeggieTale, as he's talking about the rich man, suddenly a crown pops on his forehead. So therefore, he's talking about the king. And of course, that unbelievably powerful statement, that after telling what happened, and he took the poor man's lamb that it was a kind of a pet, then David is just furious. David has a good heart, and and a lot of us are blinded by when we're the ones that are guilty. It's easy to be blinded. So David can't see that. But then, of course, I like the way I brought the picture and Stan put it in like this. It's really, really good how it has it. But anyway, that person deserves to die, and he'll pay fourfold. He'll pay back that lamb. And then you hear the King James, "Thou art the man," or "You are the man," and then David responds very quickly.
Yeah, he responds by saying that he has sinned against the Lord.
Right.
And then Nathan, continues the rebuke, and David says that, Nathan tells him that for murdering Uriah the Hittite with the sword and stealing his wife, that it is the exact same situation that's described in the story with the little lamb and the individual that just had one, and the rich man taking the one from the poorer man and then preparing it for his guest.
Yeah.
So from
go ahead.
this time on, he says, your family will live by the sword because you've despised me by taking Uriah's wife to be your own. And that live by the sword is very important as we go into the children.
Yeah, we're getting ready to see that. But here's David, who breaks 3 of the 10 commandments. He covets, he commits adultery, and murders. Breaks 3 of the 10 commandments here. And a really interesting thing here, I'll mention it now because we might forget it. David did not hold any resentment against Nathan. He didn't blame Nathan at all. Nathan shoot him out, should have shoot him out. He wasn't like Ahab who got mad at Elijah because he names the child Nathan. He will name one of his later children Nathan, which I thought was very... I remember when we got married, I was telling Juanita about some of my old girlfriends, and I mentioned one of them, and several times. She was a real sweet girl, and we got ready to have a child, and we were picking out names. We had we were getting ready to adopt a child, and we didn't know if it was going to be a boy or girl, and I suggested Marie, and Juanita said, not Marie. I'd mentioned her too many times, so it couldn't be Marie. So anyway, we had a boy.
That was his extra credit right there. So this slide here, David's wives, may be a little hard to see. Maybe you can actually see it better online than you can in here. I don't know. But we had struggles fitting it all on one screen. What it's trying to show is that this is the genogram, as John Micah talks about, of the family tree of where these people fall. And what Dr. Cloud and I found interesting is the line underneath David that's just drawn straight down to these children without necessarily understanding who they came by. So as he just said, we're not going to look at all the children because there's children that we apparently know some of the names of that we don't know anything else about. But as you can see here, it gets quite complicated when you have all of the little people figures in red are female and the ones in blue are male. And you see David there having the wives that we've gone through over the last 2 weeks and then the descendants from them. And interestingly enough, Michael not having one. So maybe his most favored wife before Bathsheba and no offspring. So that leads us to David's children and remembering this statement that the sword will not depart from your house.
Right.
And so why don't you take us through that? Dr. Cloud put this one in, leading us into this.
So what we've done is we've actually spent, we might have spent 2 weeks on the mighty men, didn't we? But anyway, we've looked at 3 areas of David's lives: his mighty men, his wives, and his children. And of course, and when you look at this chart, you begin to see the situation. You see some things on the lower left-hand side. You see Amnon was born of the lady we don't know a lot about. She was one of the ladies when he was the outlaw, married her. And then you see Absalom by Maacah. We dealt with Maacah last week, whose father was king of land just northeast of the Sea of Galilee, King Tamar. And then Tamar is also born to Maacah. And then Adonijah is going to come into play, and we don't know much about his mother. But then you get to begin seeing names of people pop up in the whole story. We talked about the mighty men, so you're going to see Joab come back into play, and other key people. But anyway, this gives you an idea. So we're dealing with the bottom there, and of course Bathsheba is going to not only produce Solomon, and then Rehoboam is thrown in as short for some reason, but it's all right. It's going to be his successor. Then there's Nathan, this other child. And look at the 2 lines, one going to Matthew's genealogy he gives, and one going to Luke's genealogy. And again, we discussed that when we did Matthew, talking about is this a kingly genealogy and actually a birth genealogy. But the point is, Bathsheba had 2 sons that come into play.
And what we're also saying is we don't, at least I don't know Ralph F. Wilson, but we wish Mr. Wilson had put a box there for the very first child that because of the sin that was committed
Right.
doesn't survive, and that causes David to get up, and interestingly enough, when that child dies, his response is to get up, clean himself, shave, and then go and worship.
Right.
Which is an interesting response that a lot of people probably would find challenging if they had prayed to God to not have their child die, and it died anyway. But unfortunately, that child doesn't make a box on that drawing. And sons were born to David at Hebron, and we talked about Hebron last week. That's where he's crowned king.
Right. He's king of Judah first. Then the civil war takes place with the north, and then he becomes king of all Israel. So he has two places in 2 Samuel that starts listing children. We already know about Abigail and Ahinoam in the wilderness. Didn't mention her, just mentioned the children, didn't mention who they were, and now that comes into play.
And then some other geographic places we've mentioned in here over the last 2 weeks. Jezreel's mentioned there on the second line. Also Geshur down here on line 5. These are places that we looked at last week when we were looking at where the wives came from and where David was at different places in his timeline.
Now, if you hadn't done all that the last couple of weeks, then David's life is very complicated, and yet, even though there's a whole book and a half of 1 Samuel, all of 2 Samuel, Chronicles has many chapters on David, and yet we only have time to talk about children who either succeeded like Solomon or got in trouble.
Oh, and we kept, just like last week, we're keeping the parallel passages listed where appropriate. So you can find this, as Dr. Cloud just said, in 2 Samuel 3 and also in 1 Chronicles 3. And so David took more concubines and wives from Jerusalem after he came from Hebron. Now he's king. Now he kind of has his entourage, harem, whichever word you want to use. And more sons and daughters were born to David. So there's the more sons and daughters that ended up in that kind of on that previous graph where you have the line drawn down there. Not exactly sure who the mothers were because the text doesn't tell us, but more sons and daughters were born to him. And so, like Dr. Cloud said, we're just going to cover the kind of the main ones, or the ones that are very instrumental to how the story twists and turns. And these are the names of those who were born to him in Jerusalem. And so we're not going to go through all of those, but those are some of the names of the children that showed up on that list a while ago that we don't know anything or very much about.
I just thought this was cute. We ran across this with all of his wives around him, sitting on the throne. Of course, it didn't happen like that, but
yeah, probably not. Not sure they would have gotten along that well. So here's another chart you put in.
Go ahead.
You sure?
Yeah.
I mean, you put it in there. So this is again the sons and then the offspring from the sons. And really what we're concentrating on this morning is that right-hand side to you under Bathsheba. You see Uriah there, who used to be, and then Bathsheba with David in the main line to the middle. And then you see this whole section down here in the right that leads to Solomon. And Solomon had even more wives and concubines than David did. 700
wives, 300 concubines. And a lot of those were political marriages.
Yeah.
Political marriages, what they were.
How many total children of who? David or Solomon? David?
One of the charts said 19. It's hard to figure it out, but it's somewhere around 19 or 20.
Yeah, which again, accounting for the one who's dead at birth, we think 20, but it depends.
And as Stan said, remember we started back with Bathsheba again, and Nathan chewing David out, the sword will not depart from your house. And remember what I said last year, that David never won Father of the Year award because he just wasn't a very good father. He set a really bad example for these next 3 children that you're going to see.
And here's your slide where it kind of expands that idea of the sword never leaving your family. So why don't you walk us through that?
Yeah, this one simply picks out those 3 that we're going to concentrate on. Amnon is going to make the first move, and then he will be countered by Absalom and actually killed by Absalom, and then Absalom is going to have help from Joab. You'll see. Actually, Joab's going to switch sides, and then finally, when you come to, he's against Absalom, kills Absalom, but he's going to be for Adonijah. So anyway, these three sons, just by chance, all their names begin with an A, and they're getting ready to come into play.
Big headaches for David. Big headaches for David.
Right.
Which we'll see in some of this as we go through it. So Tamar, different Tamar than Genesis 38, not the same person. Interesting that names appear over and over again in the Hebrew Bible. Probably a study there to go find out what some of these names mean. But now David's son Absalom had a beautiful, full sister named Tamar, and Amnon, her half-brother, fell desperately in love with her, and Amnon became so obsessed with Tamar that he became ill. Maybe not actually ill, but like lovesick, right? And then, and what's interesting, and the reason I stopped there and said it that way is what's interesting is if you haven't read this in a while, this story tells you, but that is exactly what he decides to play off of, is being ill, so that he can get closer to her. Because he has this idea that if she can just bring him his favorite dish, then she will be in close proximity to him. So he may be ill, as in ill, lovesick, ill, maybe a little sick in the head to feel this way about his sibling, but he also uses that as a deceptive way in order to lure her closer to him.
Yeah, and again, like I have said many times, that if you made a movie, The Life of David, first of all, it would be hours. It'd have to be a series, like on once a week or something like that on TV, because you have to have a scorecard. And like here's David's brother. We know David was at battle with three of his brothers. One brother was the one that Samuel mistook to be the next king, and God said, no. He's not the one. And he was at the battle when David killed Goliath. So those three brothers are mentioned, but Eliab kind of plays a major part. We just don't know a lot about all of them. If the Bible told us all this about all the characters, the book of the life of David would be, 5 or 6 or 7 books. There's just so much information about it. So here's what we don't much about. But he's got a son named Jonadab, who is a cousin of Absalom. And remember now, what's common with all these brothers and all these children, David's the father. This is what's the common denominator here. It ties them together. But here's one that is a shrewd dude, and he's a good friend of Absalom's, a cousin that's very friendly with Absalom, and he's going to give him some bad advice.
It is interesting, since you brought that up, the phrasing. Amnon told him that I'm in love with Tamar, my brother Absalom's sister, which would also be his sister.
Be his cousin.
All right, I messed
Absalom,
up. I always mess this up.
Absalom and Jonadab are cousins.
Right.
Oh, maybe you said something.
No, I'm saying that last line. I'm in love with Tamar, my brother Absalom's sister.
You are correct.
As if he's saying, my brother, who I accept, but he's trying to put distance between him and Tamar by saying she's his brother's sister.
You are correct.
Which is an interesting way to phrase that. And so he comes up with this great scheme. I tell you what to do. Go back into bed and pretend that you're ill, even though the text has already told us he is ill, but he's ill not in a physical sense necessarily, but this is going to pretend that he's ill in a physical sense. And when your father comes to see you and asks ask him to let Tamar come and prepare some food for you. And so that's what he does. He goes and lays down and he pretends to be sick. And when the king came to see him, Amnon asked him, please let my sister Tamar come and cook my favorite dish. And so Tamar took his favorite dish to him, but as she was feeding him, he grabbed her and demanded to come to bed with him. and then says, my darling sister. So that's an interesting contrast between she was his brother's sister a few verses ago. Now she's his sister. And she just says, no, my brother, that's not what is the right thing to do. But Amnon wouldn't listen to her, and since he was stronger than she was, he raped her. And then suddenly Amnon's love turned to hate, which is also a very fascinating takeaway from this situation, is oftentimes people get so headstrong about whatever it is they want to do that even when they think that's going to be the ultimate thing that's going to make them happy, that's the very thing that then that basically causes them to resent what they've just done. And that seems to be what is portrayed here.
Right. So he was sexually attracted to her. He really wasn't in love. Puppy love, or as Stan said a while ago, he was lovesick about it. But it's amazing. It's amazing. I remember one time I was counseling a couple in my office that I just asked him to step out for a few minutes, and I said to her, I said, I wouldn't marry him if he was the last guy on the face of the earth. And she said, what do you mean? And anyway, you'd understand if I told you the whole story. Well, anyway, she did listen to me. I refused to marry them. I said, this is a bad deal. And 6 months later, Juanita ran into her at the bowling alley, and she had a big black eye, and they were on the verge of getting divorced 6 months after the wedding. So that turned what she just thought was just the most wonderful guy in the world, And so anyway, I've seen that so many times.
And that's what this says. He hated her even more than he had loved her. And he thought he loved her so much that he came up with this. And so then he yells at her to get out of here and snarls at her. So that's some of that violence that you're mentioning. Yeah. Yeah. Joe said basically it's lust. And
Yeah, lust is what it is. Sex. The Hebrew word in there, I think one of the words there is aha, which is the normal word, but it's a broad word. It can be used in many different shades. But he thinks he's in love. He thinks he's in love. And turns out he's not in love at all. He mistook sexual attraction for real love.
And so then she's forced to put on robe and ashes and go into a period of lament or repentance, and she's crying, and this is a devastating thing for her. That she didn't want it to happen. She said no, but she had no way to prevent it.
Yeah, he ruined her life. She was a king's daughter. She would have been given probably to some high official or some other king in another country. David had an empire now, a mini empire, and he, like Solomon, reached out and had political marriages, and so she would have become a princess or a queen someplace, most likely, is what happened. But now she's spoiled goods, and therefore her life is ruined. The term used here for the garments, she had ripped her garment. That word is only used in 2 places in the Old Testament. This is exactly the same word used for the special robe that Jacob gave Joseph when he made him the crown sheik, when he put him over his brothers. It's exactly the same word. It's a word that means, we usually translate it in many colored coats. It means a ornamented tunic that is just got all kinds of things on it. It's just very special garment. And when the king's children wore them, were the sons or daughters, it showed they were in a special position. And she was wearing a garment that showed that she was a princess and, was going to have some kind of a happy life. And he ruined her life. To make a long story short, he ruined her life.
And now what he does by doing that is causes Absalom to have yet another focus, not this time on lust or sex, but on revenge. Because he's so mad that when he asked her if Amnon had been with her, and she said yes, he takes Tamar in, but he's not given up on paying back to Amnon what he's done. So 2 years later, you want to go through that?
2 years later, patient. He's very, very patient. He's going to wait for the right time.
Yeah, and apparently this was the right time because the sheep were being sheared, and he invited all the king's sons to a banquet or a party. And Absalom told his men, wait until Amnon gets drunk, and then at my signal, kill him. And so at Absalom's signal, they murdered Amnon, and then the other sons of the king jumped on their mules and fled because they didn't know if this was just against him or if it was going to be like, okay, all of us are going to be wiped out. But of course, it was just targeting him.
Yeah, we didn't put that in there, but what David hears at first, see what happened was Amnon is very smooth. And remember, what he's going to do, he invites David to come to the big party. And David said, I don't have time, and if I do go to the big party, it'll break you, because he takes all these people with him. I remember reading this book about King Henry VIII. It's a book introducing the story of William Tyndale. And Henry VIII would go visit other dukes and earls and high officials, and he would take 50, 60 people with him, and all the wardrobes, the beds, and everything with him, and they would just about break that duke, and they couldn't wait to get him out of there because he just ate all the food and everything. And this is actually what David says in the speech. You just couldn't afford to have me there, but you can invite your brothers, okay, you can let your brothers come.
And interestingly, while you're describing that, I'm thinking about what we also have to keep in mind, and that is that since David's not there, all this stuff is going on, and these are David's children. I mean, he loves each one of them, even though they're all messed up and they got all this stuff going on, and he may not even be aware until someone reports back to him, what each episode, as you said, each serialized TV show each week is actually having happen.
Yeah. And the guy that tells him, no, you're mistaken. All your sons aren't killed. All your sons aren't dead. It was Jonadab, that same guy, that advised Tamar what to do. Advised Absalom Amnon what to do. That same guy now is telling him that no, only Amnon is dead.
So he goes to Geshur and stays there for 3 years. I'd forgotten he stayed for so long. I mean, he's running scared at this point.
Right. So he went back to his grandfather on his mother's side, and this is an ally of David. So David doesn't try to, pursue him and send him home. I got to punish him. He doesn't do that, and it's very clear in the text that he was sad for Amnon, but he was actually sadder for Absalom. He might have been angry at Amnon too for raping his daughter.
And so Absalom is reconciled to David, and this is just an artist's depiction of what that might have looked like. But he comes back, and David's happy to receive him.
Yeah, after a while, actually what he does, I think it's 2 more years before he lets him come to the palace. And finally, Amnon tries to get Joab's attention. Joab ignores him, and so then he does something that Joab's fields, destroys some crops, and he goes and said, what are you doing? He said, well, I've been calling you, you haven't come. And so that anyway, Joab works out that a wise woman comes and talks to David. And to make a short story long here, so it's been a long time. It's been a long time. He fled, he got 2 years and 3 years and 2 years. So it's been quite a while since he's seen Absalom. And so when he came back first, he let him come back to town, but he wouldn't let him come to the palace. Again, kind of still punishing for that. But he worms his way in.
And this was an interesting little tidbit. Again, what we keep doing is trying to show you different angles of things or things you might not have read in a while. So Absalom was praised as the most handsome man in all of Israel. And he cut his hair only once a year, and then only because it was so heavy, which was an interesting statement. Not because he, I guess, felt like it was a better look, just that it was too heavy. And he had 3 sons and 1 daughter, and his daughter's name was Tamar, and she was very beautiful. And so there's that name again. So now we got 3 Tamars in the Hebrew Bible to this point, which is interesting. After this, Absalom bought a chariot and horses, and he hired 50 bodyguards to run ahead of him. So he's still not quite sure that he's not a target.
Yeah, he's what happened, the crown prince did this sometimes, and so Absalom does this. He's beginning to show his stuff and beginning to make his way and make friends, as you'll see in just a minute.
Yeah, so he got up early every morning and went out to the gate of the city. And we would go out to the gate where people would bring their cases to the king for judgment. Absalom would ask them, where in Israel they were from, and he would tell them their tribe, and then he would basically collect all this information from them and say something to the effect of, well, you've got a really strong case, and it's too bad that I'm not the person who would represent you, because if I was, then, the king would hear it. But since I'm not, you're tough out of luck, basically.
So what you see happening, David can't handle all cases. He has to handle the Supreme Court cases. He can only handle the big cases. And so 2 people would come with a problem. David would decide between them. So they left the palace with one saying, great guy, and the other guy saying, I got ripped off. Absalom would then confer with these people, especially the ones that lost, and say, it's a shame that I wasn't judging it. He'd tell both of them they had a great case. Oh, yeah, he would tell each of them that they should win the case. He simply stole the hearts of the people of Israel. That's what it says here.
There's still some false advertising on TV from lawyers about that today. I wish I were the judge, he says. Then everyone could bring their cases to me for judgment, and I would give them justice, as if they didn't get it previously. So he stole the hearts of all the people of Israel. So he swayed all these people to say, you know what, maybe if this Absalom guy was the judge, then maybe my fortune would be different. My affairs, my case would have been heard differently. It would have been won instead of lost. And so Absalom goes to Hebron. So here we go to Hebron again. But while he was there, he sent messengers to all the tribes of Israel to stir up a rebellion against the king. And they could have said David there, against his own father. As soon as you hear the ram's horn, he said, you are to say Absalom has been crowned king in Hebron. And so they had this plan that they had put the message out to enough people that when this ram's horn was blown, that would be the response, and then people would believe it, because if enough people said it, it must be true, right?
Yeah, and so what's happened, he goes to Hebron was, where Abraham was buried, Isaac and Jacob were buried. It was a very, very important city. It was where David became king of the south of Judah. So it's a very important city. And he goes down there behind David's back and gets crowned. And when David hears about this, he's got to make, and he sent for Ahithophel. Now again, we were showing you the mighty man. Now, what did we tell you about the mighty man and Ahithophel? Well, David ends up murdering Uriah and taking Bathsheba. Bathsheba's father was a mighty man named Eliab, and his father was Ahithophel. So Bathsheba was the granddaughter of Ahithophel. My theory is that, and he was David's main counselor, and he had another counselor named Hushai, but this is the guy that's got it made. But he's angry. He's angry probably because what David had done, because it was his son's daughter, and his the son-in-law is the one who got killed, of Eliab. So my theory is that Ahithophel just didn't forgive him for that, because he's in a very high-ranking position, and yet he takes Absalom's side, and I believe that's why.
Yeah, and he'd been one of David's counselors, so he knows the inside information that David would only know.
Right.
And so you put this in here to explain some of that to us.
Yeah, and so I was just going to show you, there's Ahithophel and his son Eliab, who is one of the mighty men in chapter 23 of 2 Samuel, is in the Hall of Fame, and there's his daughter. And so Uriah is Eliab's son-in-law, and he's just, I think Ahithophel thought David had done just a horrible thing and just didn't forgive him for it.
And not that it's really applicable here, but when you're doing these things and you find these different graphs like this, notice that the son who dies in infancy did get a box on this one. So it just depends on who puts things together. When you look at the offspring there from Bathsheba and David, there's actually 3 instead of just 2. So the king and all of his people set out on foot. There were 600 men from Gath, that's interesting, under Ittai, who had come with David along with the king's bodyguard. So these are probably, again, some pretty hefty military warrior type people. And David walked up the road to the Mount of Olives, weeping as he went. His head was covered, his feet were bare as a sign of mourning, and the people who were with him covered their heads and wept as they climbed the hill. And when someone told David that his advisor, Ahithophel, was now backing Absalom, David prayed, "O Lord, let Ahithophel give Absalom foolish advice." So there's an interesting prayer, very short and very sweet prayer of just, please misdirect this person.
Right. Yeah, actually, there's several chapters devoted to this whole episode here. Surprisingly, anyway, and a man named Hushai is going to, he's called David's friend. That word is also used for a close counselor. So Ahithophel is kind of the aged guy, the top guy, and Hushai also is a counselor for David. And Hushai is coming out to go with David, and David said, no, you won't do me any good here. You go back there, and you tell Absalom, yeah, you were right, I'm on your side. Of course, he was on David's side.
And so he returns to Jerusalem, getting there just as Absalom arrived.
Right.
And here's the Ahithophel, is Bathsheba's grandfather, said to Absalom, "I would choose 12,000 men and set out tonight in pursuit of David," which we know is not really a great idea. Let's go get him
clobbering before he gets a chance to organize.
This plan seemed good to Absalom and to all the elders of Israel. So that's what they decided they'd do. But Absalom said, "Summon also Hushai," who we can also hear what he has to say about this as well. And when Hushai came to him, Absalom said, "Ahithophel has given this advice. Should we do what he says? If not, give us your opinion." And Hushai replied to Absalom, "The advice of Ahithophel has given is not good for this time. You know your father and his men, and they are fighters, and they're fierce, and they're as fierce as a wild bear robbed of her cubs," which is interesting. We just saw some bears and cubs in Cade's Cove last week. "So I advise you, let all of Israel from Dan to Beersheba, as numerous as the sand on the seashore, be gathered to you, with you yourself leading them into battle. Then we will attack him wherever he may be found, and we will fall on him as dew settles on the ground. Neither he or any of his men will be left alive." So in other words, he's so strong, you don't have a chance. But if you get everybody, then you do have a chance, and he won't have a place to hide because you'll have more people that are involved.
Yeah, if you go with the group that Ahithophel said to go with, David has got his mighty men with him. He's very strong. He'll wipe you out, and the whole thing will be wasted. He said, get a big army and just crush him. And what he's trying to do is give David time to get organized. And they send word to David telling him that. And so David is going to cross over the river and is going to stay at a fortress called Mahanaim. Mahanaim was a fortress. It was the place that when Saul was killed, his son went over there with Abner and made it the capital of the north.
And again, this is a father being told your son's coming after you.
Right.
And Absalom and all of his men of Israel said, the advice for Hushai is better than that of Ahithophel, for the Lord has determined to frustrate the good advice of Ahithophel in order to bring disaster on Absalom.
He answered David's prayer, gave him time to get across the river, get organized, and so that's what happened. And we had to leave a lot of things out. There was people that came to David's aid over there and brought food. A rich named Barzillai, one of the sons of the king of Ammon, came over to help him, and so he got lots and lots of help.
And Ahithophel takes the news pretty badly. He gets his house in order, saddles his donkey, set out for his hometown, and he hangs himself.
Yeah, he took his job very seriously. Why? If David comes back, he'll execute Ahithophel. Ahithophel would have been executed for the conspiracy and the treason against David. So he just hangs himself.
So meanwhile, David crossed the Jordan River and went to the fortress of Mahanaim. Soon afterwards, Absalom crossed the Jordan with a large number of soldiers, and he appointed Amasa over the army in place of Joab. And his mother was another Abigail, the half-sister of Zeruiah, mother of
Right.
Joab.
Amasa was another nephew of David, another one of the mighty men, a type of mighty man.
Yeah. And when David came, many friends, including Barzillai, brought large amounts of food for David and his people to eat. When the battle drew near, the king commanded Joab, Abishai, and Ittai, be gentle with the young man Absalom for my sake. So he still loves his son. He's trying to do what he must do as king, but also play the role of father, dad at the same time. David's smaller army marched out in the city to fight Absalom's troops in the forest of Ephraim, where Absalom's forces were routed by David's men, and the casualties that day were great.
Yeah, I think we probably could finish Absalom quickly and save the last one till next week. How about that?
That's what I'm thinking.
Because I got a couple of things I want to talk about. But anyway, so remember what David told on one of the slides, said, be gentle with the young man. You know, capture him, but treat him nicely. And Joab heard Joab, that was his orders, but he doesn't always do his orders. Remember, he's the one who killed Abner earlier. He's does several things, and then you're going to see next week when a last son tries to take the throne in the beginning from Nathan, from Solomon. Joab is going to take the wrong side, and David's going to remind Solomon, don't let him go to the grave peacefully because of all these things he did. So
he's a pretty resilient fellow to have his hair get caught, get yanked off his horse, get stabbed 3 times, apparently 3 times with 3 javelins in his heart, and then have to be finished off by the men after that.
Right, he's got 10 armor bearers who are called Naars. They're calling that 10 armor bearers with him. And so even though David has said, spare the young man Absalom, he doesn't do it. And but Joab will pay for it in the end. He just doesn't take orders very well. So
we'll pick up there next week.
Yeah, we'll pick up. Just a couple of quick announcements. So those of you know that we're putting a trip together with Stan and Les leading the trip. We're still trying to work out the hotel situation. Then we'll have a price, hopefully this coming week. So I wanted to mention that to you. Also, we still do need a few people, not a lot of people. We need some people at nighttime for the Camp Cope, and I think we need a couple people for breakfast, but that's pretty well set and working on the medical crew. But just want to thank everybody for it, and you may lead a quick prayer about it.
That'd be great.
Gracious Father, we do thank you for the opportunity to study these people in the Bible, and by studying their lives, it will help us live our lives, and we know what these stories teach us, what pleases you and what displeases you. We thank you for the congregation here being so responsive to Camp Cope and to the needs of these young people. And so, Father, bless our efforts in that direction. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thanks, everybody. Have a great week.